This part of the class talks about mechanisms of evolution, but before I do that, let's just talk about a few of the problems that emerge because of selection and adaptation. I'm talking about problems in natural resource management. Evolutionary pressures create some familiar challenges such as the resistance of weeds to herbicides or resistance of insects. This is Colorado potato beetle to pesticides, as well as things like resistance of bed bugs to pesticides or resistance of bacteria to antibiotics. One of the things that is probably most familiar to us right now is, and the reasons that we're not in class together talking about these things is because of the tendency of pathogens to emerge in bats, especially respiratory viruses that are able to go from bats to people, not just people, but other mammals. Bats are a good evolutionary system for the emergence of respiratory viruses, and we're all dealing with that right now. Now, one of the mechanisms for changes in the genetic composition of species is mutation, and one way that mutation can happen is for viruses to get fixed into genomes. This has been shown to occur in koala as well as old world monkeys, which oftentimes you can find these things that are HIV-like viruses that are simply fixed in their genomes. They're not really active anymore, but they're constantly being passed down from generation to generation. When you have a virus that gets fixed into a genome, it changes the genome of those organisms and adds a bunch of information to it, maybe somehow conferring some capacity for phenotypic change. I want to get off the topic of viruses, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that they are not a big problem in woody plants in general, and not a problem in forests specifically. And it's not really clear why viruses are, there are many viruses, devastating viruses of agricultural crops, of perennial plants and herbaceous plants. But for some reason, they just don't emerge as problems in forests, at least they haven't yet. So mutations, here's my cat. He's got 25 toes. That's right, had lots of extra toes. Mutations, most are lethal, many are unremarkable, and many or they confer no significant change in fitness, but occasionally they do, and this is one mechanism by which you have emergence of new phenotypes. My cat, he was a great cat. He didn't let those extra toes slow him down. He made it to almost 18. So more mechanisms of how you create new species. Migration is very important, especially when it comes to forests. Forests are constantly, tree species, all species of plants being constantly pushed around and moved around the globe by changes in the environment. And this mechanism creates introduction as well as isolation. Those two things can lead to the emergence of new phenotypes and eventually new species. Let's talk about two closely related mechanisms, that's isolation and divergence. And I'd like to demonstrate this by highlighting foxtail pine and bristlecone pine. These are two closely related species that occur on two adjacent mountain ranges. Foxtail pine is a southern Sierra species, and bristlecone pine occurs in the White Mountains. They're only separated by tens of miles, but they are in they occur across a barrier which they cannot traverse. Now, years and years apart has created different species through something that's known as divergence. This is these two, even though these places are close together and these species have a lot in common, their environment is different, and the two species have started to reflect that through changes in their phenotype. The Sierra Nevada is wetter. It also gets some summer rain, whereas the White Mountains has less summer rain and it's drier. That's created, like I say, phenotypic differences between the two species. Another mechanism, and this is a pretty interesting one, is convergence. And this is where evolutionary pressures create things that are not closely related, but look similar. And one of the more familiar examples of this is the thylacine. This is the marsupial wolf. It's now extinct. Couldn't be more further related from the wolves of the northern hemisphere in terms of its phylogeny. But these they look like wolves. They looked like wolves. They acted like wolves, and they have the same ecological niche. Convergence happens in forest trees, and here's an example. Nothofagus, Araucaria, and Piacea, what do they have in common? Almost nothing phylogenetically, but they are occurring in very similar environments, despite that Nothofagus is, this photograph on the left was taken in the South Island of New Zealand. The Araucaria, Nothofagus forest, which you see in the center, is taken in Chile, and then on the right you've got Picea, spruce, and that photograph was taken in Minnesota. In each of these cases, cold environments, long winters, all the characteristics of these species are reflecting those. And some of the characteristics that they have are small leaves and both physiological and biochemical adaptations to cold. Convergence happens. There's some other examples of convergence I think are kind of even more clear when you look at the examples, and that's things like Cook Island pine or Norfolk Island pine. These are Araucaria species, and they look a lot like Douglas fir in many respects, even though they don't have much in common phylogenetically. Another mechanism by which things change is called genetic drift, and these are random changes in genes or allele frequency over time. And you can see the effect of that in things like redwood, which are isolated. There's been a diversification and specific genetic adaptations to the very narrow range of environmental conditions in California, things like frost tolerance and heat tolerance and so forth. And the last thing I want to broach is just conservation in terms of evolution. Remember that the genetic makeup of species is part of biodiversity in the world, and that genetic diversity represents a potential resource for sustaining the species that we care about, whether it's things like fish or agricultural products or forests.